Good evening and welcome to our board meeting tonight. If you would please stand and join me with the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
May we have the roll call?
All right, Trustee Grimm?
Here.
Trustee Jessberger?
Here.
Trustee Sira?
Here.
Fiscal officers here. Township Administrator? Here. Chief of Fire? Here. Chief of Police? Here. Superintendent of Public Works? Here. Code Compliance? Here.
Our next meeting is April 7th, 2022 at 6:30 p.m. at 999 Chambers Road. I'd like to make a motion to accept the agenda with flexibility.
Seconded.
All right, Trustee Grimm?
Yes.
Trustee Sira?
Yes.
Trustee Jessberger?
Yes. And we can start the discussion of street trees.
There we go. I'm going to use teacher voice if I need to, but I can hear myself, so I think we're okay. So I wanted to take a breath about the Tree City USA program and just allow us some time to talk about it to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to where we are with our planning around public trees and our membership in Tree City USA. I've been at a couple of meetings now where residents have asked, for example, why are we spending money planting trees? And I think it's important to just address that and take a look. So what I did was I just did a really simple Google search about benefits of trees in community. And you can get a ton of results right away. This one surprised me. I didn't know about this, that there are many studies out there that show that trees actually reduce crime in neighborhoods. This one showed that levels of aggression and violence were significantly lower when people had nature nearby their apartment than they were with those who lived in barren areas. It's not affected by socioeconomics either. The same thing happens in Connecticut, that a 10% increase in tree canopy resulted in a 14% decrease or 15% decrease, depending on which type of crime you measure. That was similar to the results found in Baltimore and in Chicago as well. 48% fewer property crimes and 56% fewer violent crimes in and around the buildings that they studied in Chicago, apartment buildings with more and less green space. You can find more on those studies here at the Vibrant Cities Lab if you're interested in checking them out in more detail. But here's a little more on that Chicago one. So they compared residential buildings, and the basic idea here with the graphs is as vegetation increased, so as we go to the right, the higher the vegetation, the lower the crime. The higher the vegetation, the lower the property crime. The higher the vegetation, the lower the violent crime. This was a pretty serious study. It took data over 2 years based on the inner city apartment complexes that I mentioned. Just another thing that showed up on my phone when I did that Google search. Again, here we're seeing it from smart cities. That number, that a 10% increase in trees roughly equated to a 12% decrease in crime. That was the one I didn't know about, but remember, we have talked about stuff like this before. We know trees increase property values in residential neighborhoods. They improve business corridors. They have health benefits, mainly reducing pollution and asthma rates. Their effect on the ambient temperature directly impacts our pocketbooks in terms that we spend less for our energy use in our homes. Columbus is all over the urban trees at the moment, too. They have spent a lot of money in the last couple of years developing their urban forestry plan. And this map is really an interesting breakdown. You can go to the website and actually interact with it and click on different neighborhoods and get different statistics. So it's a really great interactive tool. But just some basic notes I made for you over there on the left. Clintonville is one of the highest neighborhoods, has 41% canopy coverage in that neighborhood. Now, since this was a City of Columbus study, you'll see that there are places left out of it. So we can't look up our neighborhood on the City of Columbus study, but we can pretty much extrapolate from the neighborhoods right next door. And so Linden, for example, has only half of the canopy of Clintonville. They were in the 20s percentiles. The same is true as you wander more towards our west side. The same is true of the University District and Olentangy West neighborhood. They were also in the 20s of percentiles. 40 is like the minimum recommended. And then 5th by Northwest is astonishingly even lower at 14%. Again, that may or may not be exactly reflective of our neighborhoods, but those are the next neighborhoods next door. Once again, we're seeing that crime statistic, but also 20-degree reduction in summertime ambient air temperature, 11% increase in sales for shopping distance that are well-treed, and then a 60% reduction in street-level pollution. One of the things to really notice is that environmental development impacts economic development. These things are all very related. We already know that social parts of our community stuff are related to economic development, but the fact that the environment plays an integral role there as well is something that we want to start keeping in the forefront, I think. And when we look at models of what happens, notice that this is a cycle. So economic development impacts businesses, businesses impact communities with parks and infrastructure and public safety, employees impact economic development. So all of those things are foundational and related to each other. So when we say trees aren't economic development, that's not really true. They are related. And when we invest in our residential neighborhoods, we're investing in community development and economic development. They support each other. So when we're looking at these investments in trees, streetlights, sidewalks, the other kinds of infrastructure, we talk about our drainage projects, our sidewalks. We are doing economic development because we're doing community development. And that's where businesses want to move, and it's where employees want to live. So in our first year of talking about Tree City, which was last year, we formed the tree board, which is basically the sustainability committee. We decided at that point, after meeting with some residents, that in our first year we were going to plant public trees at our parks. And we did over 30, I think, over 30 some trees last year on both sides of town in all of the parks. This year we were going to start a street tree program where residents could apply if they were interested in having the township place a tree in front of their home in the township right away. So it wouldn't be in their front yard, it would still be in the township right away. But we're not going to just put those any old place, only where folks are interested in having them. The plan is that Mr. Medley is actually going to look at those sites once a resident applies, says, yes, I'm interested, He'll look at the site and determine if it's an appropriate place. Obviously, we don't want it blocking one of our solar streetlights, or if it's already heavily shaded, what's the point of trying to grow a sunny tree there? So once he decides that the site's okay, then we can go ahead with the planting, and we're hoping that because residents will have voiced interest in the program, that they'll even help us, if necessary, monitor the status of that tree in its first season while it's getting developed, established, maybe even help us out with watering if they see a need, or at least call us if they see the need. So Mr. Medley and Glenda have been working this week with me, and we have developed sort of an online form where folks could apply and get started with the street tree program. So I just wanted to make sure before we pressed go on that we've had a chance to talk about it one last time, and that we're ready to move forward with that piece. So I guess at this point, questions would be appropriate, or discussion. That's all I have on it.
How many trees would be allowed per resident? Are we looking at just like one application for one tree?
Well, so in the documents that we adopted last year, we had some spacing suggestions in there. So if a resident were interested in small trees and had enough frontage, they could theoretically get more than one. But if they were interested in a large shade tree, probably not, given the size of most of our frontages.
Would there be, this may not be the last question, but is there any sort of incentive for our residents for applying for a tree? Like,
I hadn't thought of that. I mean, we're going to put it in at our cost. We're going to maintain it. It's a public tree, so we'll be the ones doing eventual pruning or maintenance as needed. But I hadn't really considered any incentives other than planet.
is there a projected timeline for this?
In terms of launching, in terms of completion, we're ready to push the button. I just wanted to give you all a chance to talk about it first before we just put it up on our website.
I mean, like, are we gonna say you have until this date, and then the trees will be planted at this time? Is there any like structure to that at this time?
No. I think once we cross a certain boundary, if we get into heat of the summer drought, we're obviously going to start talking to residents about fall planting. But we can certainly start until that point, getting some spring trees in for people who are interested.
And if the township will be the ones to assist with like the upkeep, I'm not. My mic was not on. I'm not. I guess I don't know much about greenery stuff, but will this be something that obviously the resident would have to give permission for our individuals to be on their property?
So that's why it's going to be in the right of way.
The right of way, okay.
So it would be just like us doing anything else, working on a street light or a fire hydrant.
Okay.
Is there gonna be a restriction to like not putting these trees near where existing streetlights are, since they're solar powered?
Yeah, that's why Mr. Medley's going to have to approve. You don't just automatically get one because you apply. If your site really doesn't work out for one reason or another, we just can't work it out.
And are we gonna pre-order the trees, or are we gonna wait to see how many orders we receive before we purchase the trees?
We'll gather a handful of applications and purchase them as we go. We don't want them sitting around.
And is there like a specific size, or how old of tree would we be planting?
It'll depend a lot on availability and the species. So our idea is that residents can indicate whether they think their site is best for a small, medium, or large tree. And then we'll show them a list that has a handful of choices in each size. But all of that is based on seasonal availability, and Acorn Farms is our vendor. So it's not going to be a guaranteed thing that every tree is always available.
Are we gonna
or that we're just going to decide that it's one kind, because we don't want monoculture anyway.
Are we gonna focus on native trees, I'm assuming?
Yes.
And for county roads, like Ferris, I can't think of the other ones right now.
Cook.
Do those
I-
also,
I don't know the answer to
qualify?
this. Do you, Mr. Madley? You know,
I would believe that is something that the county would be involved in, whether they would allow them or not. And maybe
it's a great question.
research a little more.
Yep.
I don't think we own the jurisdiction.
We'll make a call. We've gotten all kinds of cooperation from them doing other stuff, so including putting up our street lights on county roads. So it may just be an extra step in the process we have to work out. Thanks for bringing that up. Anything else?
I don't have anything else.
So I think we're ready then. Glenda, thanks for your help with getting the online form ready. So we'll just go ahead and push the button on publishing that for tomorrow. So we'll start looking for that in social media news, et cetera, as opportunities for folks to apply. Thank you.
And when you do find out the answer for the county roads, can that also be posted
Sure.
on, I don't know, our social media?
Yeah.
Or-
Yeah, we may have to do something special with the application if we find out that it's something different, a different process for the county. We'll get that figured out.
All right, moving down to the fiscal officer. I'd like to make a motion to approve the March 3rd minutes.
I'll second.
Yes.
We're having mic issues there. Okay, it's on. All right. Trustee Grimm.
I honestly haven't had a chance to read them, because I didn't see them in my inbox until today. So I don't really feel comfortable approving these at this time. So no.
No. Okay, Trustee Sierra.
Yes.
Trustee Jasperger.
Yes.
And then something not on the agenda, amending the 2022 permanent appropriations.
Like you're wanting that to be a motion, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the police chief had to cancel his vehicle purchase that we approved late last year. And so for him to be able to buy any vehicles, we would have to amend perms. And so the only changes are in the police fund, putting $100,000 in his motor vehicle line item, and then put a little bit more in contracted services and I think $1,000 for electricity.
And are those numbers already reflected?
Yeah, the changes are bolded. Everything else is the same as what
Oh.
2 weeks ago.
So we've got over 1.9 appropriated as a total for police now. Do they have anything left on the certificate of estimated resources, or is that
Yes.
everything?
No, they have about 200,000.
Could we start seeing that, just as a suggestion moving forward, in maybe a new column that just, like, yes, what's left from, there's always a little, I know that you like to leave as a padding between what's available to be appropriated. It'd be great to see that. Thanks.
I can yammer at you more.
So I'd like to make a motion to approve the 2022 permanent appropriations draft today. Okay. That was hard. Sorry.
It is difficult when we don't have it written on.
I'll second.
Ready for the roll call?
Yes.
Okay. Trustee Sierra.
Yes.
Trustee Grimm.
Yes.
Trustee Jasperger.
Yes. All right, on to committee and team reports.
Just wanted to take another opportunity to announce while we're on YouTube and everything else that April 30th, we'll be holding a combined Arbor Day Earth Day celebration. We will have the electric vehicles out on display as well as the solar charging units on the fire equipment. We'll have prescription drug take back that day for interested folks. We're not calling it trash drop off, what are we calling it? A cleanup kind of a day where residents can bring.
It'd be like a basement or a garage cleanup, odds and ends that you just want to get rid of that day.
You bring it, we'll get it in a dumpster?
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll have a second dumpster back there available to put on next.
Garage and basement cleanup, but not toxic.
Right, like no house, the chemical stuff needs to be dealt with as usual.
It'll be listed when it has it.
Yeah, folks can find lots of information about that on the SWACO site if they're curious, but we'll only be taking the typical stuff. Also, the litter sweep will be going on that day, so fire department will be helping us out. Again, community volunteers, so we're going to try and clean up Cleveland Avenue. Thank you, and we'll have trees. We'll have trees available for folks to take home and plant.
Yes, what's your question?
Will you be taking tires too?
Not at this time.
I mean, on that day?
No, we're going to try to maybe do something in the fall.
In the fall?
Yeah, we thought about doing a tire collection. One other thing we'll have to deal with the county and see if there's any programs out there, because sometimes they get a program where they can collect so many tires a year. We get that, and we can just offload them off your guys' vehicles or whatever, put them in the dump truck, and take them right to the disposal place.
And this was April 30th?
10 to 2.
And do we have, are there any other agencies that will be assisting with any of this, or is this just our township?
Just our township, correct?
Okay.
We actually reached out to PESA to have some of the volunteers come in that day. I'm not quite sure how many we'll be able to get, but they're going to advertise for us.
Okay, awesome.
That's our guys.
Okay, anything else with that? No. Okay, nothing for administration. Okay, moving down to Chief Raley with fire.
Yes, we'd like to request a motion to authorize the fire chief to enter an affiliation agreement with the OSU College of Social Work to allow interns to be placed at Clinton Township.
So moved.
Second.
Yes.
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 And next, we'd like to request a motion to authorize the fire chief to enter an affiliation agreement with the Delaware Area Career Center, allowing students to receive experience in the emergency services profession by writing here.
So moved.
Second. Trustee Sierra? Yes. Trustee Grant?
Yes.
Trustee Desper?
Yes.
That's all we have.
Thank you, Chief. And on to Chief Jones with police.
Yes, tonight I'd like to present to the board and the citizens of the community. I reached out to Waypoint Safety Consulting to have an outside perspective and an outside look at the operations of the police department as far as staffing goes, where we're staffing our officers shift-wise, the volume of runs we get. As another today, phone call about traffic issues. People want to see more officers on the street. However, with the run volume we're currently in, handling, we just can't be everywhere at the same time. In addition to that, it was Tuesday, we had officers in Sergeantburg go down to Hockey College to a career fair. They had 4 people in their law enforcement program. 20 police departments went to the job fair to try to recruit for 4 people. So that's kind of the things that we're facing. So bringing Waypoint in, I'm going to introduce them here in a minute to give their presentation. But just to touch base on that, Chief Jim Gilbert was not able to be here tonight to discuss some things with our working relationship with the Sheriff's Department, Mifflin Township as well. Currently, Mifflin Township does not have a 3rd shift police operation, so the county is taking over those duties, which is pulling some resources from us. He was going to be here to share information on that as well, so I don't want to speak on behalf of the Sheriff's Office. We do have a deputy up here tonight, a community liaison. If you have some insight today you want to share. Okay. I don't want to put you on the spot. But yeah, I had some conversation with the chief.
Above your pay grade, is it?
And you know, they do help out a lot up here on the northeast part of the county. We have the benefit with them having the substation here. But they're being pulled in different directions as well. They're trying to staff a new jail. They don't have enough deputies to get that up and going, which means until the jail is staffed, they can't put deputies from the jail out on the road to help the patrol division. So everyone's seeing this. As you well know, Columbus Police Department, we don't see them a lot in the area. They've lost, I think, over 300 some officers in the last 2 years. But we want to take care of our own here. That's what we do. So with that in mind, that kind of introduction for me, I'd like to turn it over to Waypoint for their presentation, what they've come up with.
I left everything right there for you.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Or do I need to be at the microphone? Okay. I'll try being at the mic here for a few minutes. So let's see. So my name is Dave Rose, and I'm one of the managing partners of Waypoint Safety Consulting. And first, on behalf of our company, we just want to say that we're really pleased and honored to be here and be part of this valuable discussion about police staffing. I mean, it's one of the underlying tenets that the government's supposed to provide for you, right? The safety of your community, and there's nothing more important than police staffing as one of the base services. So we're honored to be part of that. Just a little bit about me to begin with, a bit of introduction. So I'm currently serving as the chief of police at Denison University out in Granville, Ohio, and I'm also one of the managing partners for Waypoint. I have 31 years in law enforcement in total, and most of that has been command staff experience. I was on the command staff at the Ohio State University Police Division for over 20 years, the last 15 years as a captain. The university is kind of a well-kept secret from a policing standpoint. It's one of the larger police departments in the area. When you think about the size of that community, there are 100,000 residents there, or 100,000, the population is 100,000 every day. And so that means that if OSU were a city, it's the 7th largest city in Ohio by population. It would be between Dayton and Parma. And because of that, it has kind of commensurate police services. It functions very much like a municipal agency, but with all the value-added stuff you would get in university policing as well. When I was the patrol captain, for example, I had 45 police officers and supervisors that worked 24 hours a day. It was uniform patrol. We had a bomb detection canine program, a mounted unit, SWAT team, a dignitary protection unit, a crime scene team, and I mean the typical resources you would see with a municipal agency. And the reason why I bring all that up is because the other thing the university really liked to do is train us. Over 2,000 hours of training, law enforcement training, plus my degrees are from OSU. I have a bachelor's and a master's from OSU and the coursework for a doctorate. It was all provided through the university. And it's like when you're a police captain there, it's like a living and learning laboratory when you think about police staffing. We had day-to-day staffing needs just like your department does here. patrol staffing to respond to crime and calls for service. And at the same time, we had every scope and scale of staffing that I could have possibly wanted to practice this type of skill, everything up to and including OSU football games and stadium concerts and arena concerts, or even visits by the President of the United States. So just a broad base in staffing. I'm going to turn it over to Sean, the other managing partner.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sean Bolander. I am the other founding partner of Waypoint Safety Consulting. I, too, also worked at Ohio State University in their Department of Public Safety as one of their civilian program managers, where I earned my bachelor's degree and master's degree from Ohio State in business administration. I took a slight detour to New York City to spend over 3 years in federal law enforcement with the Department of Justice. And then returned back to the state of Ohio to be the director of public safety for Ohio Wesleyan University. So you can see we've had some similar overlap in our careers here. But one of the additional shared experiences we have is that our coursework and fields of study have heavily emphasized statistics and data analysis. I have a Lean Six Sigma black belt, which that sounds fancy with the black belt, but it's not actually like a martial art. It's just their way of saying that I have the ability to analyze pretty significant data sets and try to minimize defects and do in-depth research and be able to present conclusions based on that research. And I'm going to hand it back over to Dave to discuss what we have uncovered through our research here with Clinton Township Police Division.
Thanks. So the scope of this study, really, we were looking at the patrol workload. Taking a look at how many officers you should have in uniform responding to calls for service, and taking an inventory of how many officers you already have as well. So we were looking at that workload, and we're proponents in our company, we're proponents for looking at all of those calls for service and quantifying or adding up all the time that the officers are spending on calls for service, trying to determine what the optimal workload or what the best number of officers is for that demand for service, and then creating a staffing model to help distribute the workload evenly in the event that you would choose to add additional services. And with the data analysis that we do, we can actually drill down to kind of a granular level and make suggestions for how many officers based on even the hour of the day and the day of the week and that sort of thing. So when you think about time allocation for policing, this is a time-tested model that was introduced by the International Association of Chiefs of Police more than 30 years ago. And there are other models, but this one is quite effective. And when you look at this, you have 3 buckets of time here that we'll keep referring back to. And these are really meant to be equal buckets of time. You have call response work, and you'll hear us talk about calls for service, dispatched calls, call response. All those things mean the same thing. That's the actual time a police officer is dispatched by a dispatcher to go to a call when you call from the community, and then the time that they clear. So that amount of time in there that's bracketed by those times. The next one is non-enforcement work, and we think of this as the business work of being a police officer, and you can almost think of it, really the sales tax analogy is the best one. When you think about that call for service, police officers don't just show up kind of magically in the car ready to go in the community. There's things that they have to do around those calls for service that are part of being a police officer. So for example, shift briefings where they talk about crime trends in the area, getting the car ready to actually go out on patrol, putting gas in the car at the end of the shift. You may be dispatched from the east side of Clinton Township to the Lenox area, but as soon as you clear that dispatch call, the drive time back here, that's part of the business of being a police officer here at Clinton Township. That's not accounted for in those calls for service. And then that last bucket is proactive policing. And this is really where police departments have to sacrifice if not enough time is in the pool of available hours. So this call response time, or those dispatch calls, it could be calls from any source. Examples would be calls from members of the public because they witness a suspicious person looking into vehicles in a parking lot. It could be an alarm that comes in. It could even be one of the officers that has, signaled a traffic stop or spotted someone looking through vehicles over at the Lenox Town Center, for example. Those high-risk calls, one of the things that we have to do when we actually add up the time for calls for service, we have to take into account that not every call is just one police officer. And so for the purposes of this model, we've assumed that those higher risk or high priority calls for service are 2 police officers. The reality is that if it's a shooting call, it's more than 2, and you're actually borrowing from your neighbors when that happens. You get help from Columbus Police Department or Mifflin during the days or evenings, that sort of thing. But likewise, your police officers also have to kind of pay that back when there's something significant that happens right outside of the jurisdiction. The good news is that's captured in those calls for service for us to be able to estimate. That being said, Chief Jones did bring up that there's some future changes that are probably coming along that you need to start thinking about now because, as he mentioned, hiring is not easy these days. I will tell you, I talk with my colleagues from across the state on a regular basis, and this has been the story. I was in training with a chief from Eastern Ohio back in February of last year, and he said that he had 5 openings and 2 applicants. And so that's all part of the story as well. And so it means that you have to be proactive and think about that ahead of time. So again, as I said, that's 1/3 of the time is allocated for that call response. We talked about this non-enforcement work. The other categories in here, it could be report writing. A lot of times if you're a police officer and you respond to somebody's house, they had something stolen, let's say yesterday. So it's not a higher priority call that just happened, but they're going there to document the offense, maybe for your insurance, or to see if it connects to a crime trend even. They have to write that report somewhere. So after they clear from the scene, that's also part of that sales tax or that non-call response business. Proactive policing, this allows for the focus of patrol activity on crime trends, but it also allows for uniformed officers to be engaged in community engagement, crime prevention activities, and that sort of thing. And I know that there's a national dialogue about police and policing and how we engage with the community. So I would encourage a broader conversation about that, but it's not in the scope of this study specifically. Okay, so let's talk about the data. The hard part about doing this job right now is that you really want a full year of data because you can see from this graph, you can see that there is some, right here, each one of the columns is a month from 2019, and you can see that in the warmer months, this tends to be higher. The rows over here, these numbers are the number of calls for that given month. So you can see something like 625 calls or so for January of 2019. But you can see that there's some seasonality to this, right? As the weather gets warmer, the calls for service go up, and that's not unique to this community. It's kind of expected. But what we saw when we looked at 2020 and 21 is exactly what you think we'd see. In March and April, the calls were much flatter. And the reason for that is because everything was closed. And so when you think about modeling, specifically if you're looking for the average number of calls by day of week and even the shift or even the hour of day, you want to make sure you're using a normal data set. So 2020 and 21 were both affected by the pandemic. So we chose to use 2019 for these purposes. It's probably pretty representative of what police work in Clinton Township will look like moving forward. So a little bit about the methods. So the first thing, and again, this is probably the anthropologist in me. That's the discipline that I studied in college. We really value the context in which policing is done here. Some of these models are all quantitative, meaning they look at the number of calls for service and you kind of plug and chug through the formulas and it tells you how many cops you need. Or there'll be allocation models based on, per capita with the population or that sort of thing. And really, those ignore the context of your situation. So, for example, Plain City, Ohio, which is around the Madison County, Union County line, has just about the same population as Clinton Township. But Clinton Township sits in the middle of Columbus with a population of 900,000 people, and we all know the crime is higher here, right? And so if you look at it just based solely off the number of people that you have, Or even the calls, if their calls are representative, let's say they have 8,000 calls, it doesn't mean that it's the same 8,000 calls. It may very well be a different distribution of those high priority calls. That's really important to consider. So we spent some time, Sean and I both spent some time with Chief Jones and talked through how the modeling is done here. And then we spent a deep dive into your specific data. So we look at that data and we basically add up all of those times. And it's really important to know that, again, if you have those high priority calls, there's a multiplier in there because it's 2 police officers and not 1. And it gives you the ability to calculate that total kind of burden of time that you would spend on call response. The next thing we did was determine the workload of current staff, and we used 2021 data, and you would say, why not use 2019? And it's because you've had staffing turnover, and when you're thinking about trying to model what the average police officer looks like in terms of time on the street, you want to use the current staff with the most recent data. Because you've had people that have left and retired. There's actually 3 fewer police officers from 2019 to 2021. So there's been a change in that staffing. So you really want to look at what the average police officer works on patrol for now. So we use that 2021 leave pattern. And then we define what's called a full-time equivalent. And really all that means is just the average cop. So if you know the total amount of time you need to staff patrol, and you know what the average police officer works, you just divide one by the other, and it gives you the total number of police officers that you need. That's kind of the simplified model. And then, of course, we model shifts using the average data and using that call data and Excel spreadsheets. We're able to look at the average amount of time, for example, on Tuesday at 2 o'clock in the morning, the average amount of time police officers spend on calls. So a fancy chart here, and really the details down at the bottom are really, you're not going to be able to see every one of these columns. But one of the things that we wanted to do is look at how the police officers are spending the majority of their time. I think you should all know that. And if you look, there were 8,303 calls during that time frame. Out of those, the police dispatchers use codes. So you might have heard like dispatching someone on an auto accident with injury. If that's reported, then that CAD call is coded as an auto accident with injury. There are 87 unique code types in the county system that are used, and out of those, 20 of them account for 80% of what the police officers here are doing. This is in order, by the way. So number 1 is where they're spending the highest amount of time, all the way down to number 20. But again, this is 80% of the call volume. And I'd highlight that there's some things in here like domestic complaints, suspicious person in car, auto accidents with injuries, larceny in progress, fights, missing persons, suicide attempt. These are calls where you really want more police attention than just one police officer responding. So again, just an interesting peek into how they're spending the majority of their time. So we talked about those call priority types. There's 87 total call types. 55 of those are high priority and 32 are regular priority. So think 1 officer calls and 2 officer calls out of those different call types. And out of your 8,300 calls, 5,549 of them, or just over 2/3, are 2 officer calls. And so this is why I said that context is really super important, because this is not the same as policing in Plain City or in Granville, where Denison University, where I work, where it's just not the same thing. These are higher priority calls, and that demands about 10,000 hours of officer time just in that, from dispatch to cleared. That's it. Okay. So again, just a little more about these calls, something that we thought was interesting. Again, 1 officer calls, routine priority, 2 officer calls, high priority. You can see that during the daytime, here's the number of calls on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. This is really useful information for Chief Jones, because Tuesday and Thursday are the busiest days of the week. May not have guessed that, right? But when you think about it from a staffing perspective, it's useful. That being said, about half of the calls, not 2/3 as we mentioned before, but about half of the calls are high priority runs. Evening shift is even busier, and you can see it's a slightly lower ratio. The light blue is the 1 officer calls, 2 officer calls. And then if you look at night shift, What jumps out at me immediately is there are fewer calls, but almost all of them are high priority calls, right? Concerning, and this is what needs to be staffed appropriately for community safety. So when we look at this, when you think about that 2019 data and the amount of time that officers spend on patrol now with the total number of officers you have officers spending 70% of their time from call dispatch to call cleared, okay? So that means that these officers are task saturated at this point, because if you go back and you put 70% into this one bucket, then you have just under a third left for non-enforcement work and you have nothing left for proactive policing. And that's what the officers are experiencing right now. And you can even see that in the 2021 data, because really there's a lower call number for that time period, and almost all of those calls were in traffic stops and suspicious person calls. And it's because, again, it's not a big drop in calls, but it is those officer-initiated types of calls that are kind of suffering the most for that. So you look at the workload of the current staff. Again, there's outside factors that need to be accounted for. So, Mike, do you have anything else you want to say about mutual aid or the county staffing distribution at this point?
Particularly with, again, and I hate to bring up our neighbors, but they get similar type runs. And again, if the deputies are handling their call volume, again, that's our officers that sometimes don't have that backup, or that's us helping the deputies out as their backup in our neighbors. The next closest mutual aid is Blendon Township, which was up on the other side of 161 and really western. And they could be up at Hoover Dam in their jurisdiction to respond down here if we need them. And sometimes they do. So I could go back several years ago when we had plenty of officers. We didn't have COVID, pre-COVID years. We could rely on CPD or the sheriff's office. We had plenty of officers. And the other thing is the mass exodus of officers from all these other agencies that surround us. They're being depleted as well. So again, that's another important factor I think that I wanted to bring in as well.
Has any of this data been disaggregated to address that? I mean, of all of these runs, and what percentage of that is us solving everybody else's problem?
It's hard to capture that exactly. It's probably not a large number of runs, but you have to figure it balances out, because the crime up in this area, I mean, the criminals don't trip over an invisible boundary when they walk into Clinton Township, right? And so what that means is you're responding outside of Clinton Township to help when you have to, but that also addresses crime in the area. I mean, if you have a shooting that's 2 blocks away from Clinton Township, it affects Clinton Township. Likewise, if you have a shooting 2 blocks inside of Clinton Township, all those other agencies are responding here. And so we didn't look at that specifically, but what I would say, just from my experience, is that probably you're getting a pretty even trade.
Yeah, our mutual aid calls, and I have to pull those numbers. I think we've got those off the CAD system for you guys as well. Per month, maybe around 20. I can tell you last month I did have the county pull the CAD numbers. Cassidy got those for me, and we had 81 calls in Clinton Township that the sheriff's office handled for us because we were not. And I don't know, because I didn't get numbers that they provide calls in the township for us. I get our number call.
I suspect that the numbers are probably dozens, not hundreds, if that helps. But to give you put a point on it. And so again, back to the point though, if you say no, we're not responding out of Clinton Township, the repercussions for that are the outside agencies say, well, then we won't respond to Clinton Township.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm just trying to wrap my brain around what it looks
like.
So, Mike, if you just had a guess, I'm not holding anybody's feet to the fire or anything, but just so we're not talking thousands of numbers and that stuff, like just percentage to percentage, what would you ballpark is percentage of calls in the township and percentage of count outside?
Probably, I off the top of my head, knowing, because I've kind of been paying attention to this last few months, we go into, say, Mifflin or up to Minerva Park, because they run one officer. Typically on a day, it could be 2 to 3 times in a day that we respond outside of the township. And that's not us. We used to respond to CPD calls. Now we've had a few shootings on Oakland Park, which there were jurisdictional issues that typically, we don't even respond on CPD calls anymore. And we used to do that on mutual aid around the Northland area, and we don't do that. So really, it's the Mifflin Township area and the area between here and Blanton that we mutually respond to. Could be 2-3 times a day. Them coming into us is kind of the same thing. We're tied up. She's not here tonight, but farmers, they had a garage broken into, and they explained that a couple weeks ago that they had a Mineral Park Farm sheriff's deputy show up because, again, we were tied up somewhere else and we couldn't respond to the call.
So it's a draw, you think? We have just as many out as we do coming in?
We're not predominantly coming to save the day for anybody, but it is a mutually kind of thing where we would typically, Mifflin, we respond there, they respond up here. My only thing, and I like to kind of look into the future, especially, policing and the things that I do, is seeing Mifflin Township and their numbers falling, the budget's falling, they're not gaining any more police. I think it's to the point, talking to their chief, I couldn't tell you when or where, but it's just not going to get better. And not that we're going to take over Mifflin Township and take their ones, it's going to get down with them. But then again, that's deputies not helping us, but taking care of that unincorporated area.
It all comes out of that first bucket of time, right? Anything else on those two bullets, Mike? Okay. All right, so when you think about optimized patrol staffing, so if you really go back to this 33% of their time spent on those calls for service, you currently have 11.3 full-time equivalents. Now, the way that number is calculated is, for example, you have a number of part-timers here, and you can calculate using all the part-time hours how much they are in terms of the ratio compared to a full-time officer. So they count as just over 1/2 of a full police officer, if that makes sense. You also have a lieutenant that spends part of his time in an administrative capacity, a small part, and then a much larger part in patrol. And so he contributes, but not one full FTE. It's a percentage of an FTE. And so that means you have 11.3 at this point. And if you just simply plug those numbers together, it looks like 17 is the magic number. And so the way you probably would get there, and again, you all have to have a discussion about what appropriate staffing looks like here. All we're doing is showing what the model says is the most appropriate to right-size that workload and give back proactive policing. But at the end of the day, we recognize that this is a complicated discussion where there's fiscal realities and there's also balanced with the citizens' tolerance for criminal activity in the area, right? And I understand that's a political question and a discussion that you all have to have on your own, but the reality is that's what the workload looks like. So for 17, if you're going to fill that, then there are 3 vacancies that have basically faded out through attrition over the last 2 years. 2 police officers left, and you had a sergeant that left. And really, we recommend putting a sergeant back. I mean, you put 3 police officers there, but there's what's called a span of control. You really want for every set number of police officers, you want supervisors there. The primary job of a police supervisor is rule enforcement, policy enforcement of the agency. And so when you think about it, just from an accountability standpoint, police supervision is an important part of the equation if you add this much staff back. And then the other thing is that there would be 2 new officer positions, and then I would balance out the rest of that time with part-time hours, assuming you could even find them at this point. And of course, we had a discussion about whether you do this with part-time staff or how you do this. And again, how many part-timers do you have right now, Mike? 4. And so you would probably need to fill this number of hours. We would estimate the amount your current part-timers work, you'd probably need about 30 more. And if you're going to hire 1 in 20, the pool is not there. I mean, it just doesn't exist. And so that's kind of a non-starter to think about it from a part-time perspective. But you probably can find some part-timers that would want to work, and that really helps fill in the cracks where we can predict where the needs are. And so now there has to be questions. Does anybody have questions? Yes.
So that third bucket, you said proactive policing, would that be looking for speeders?
It could be, it's anything the community and the police agency feel are important, and it could be anything from community engagement events. and crime prevention events. Some places use it to engage with schools in their jurisdictions, but by and large here, I mean, given that ratio, 5,549 high priority calls, it's probably going to be proactive policing focusing on target areas, which is traffic enforcement and watching for, pattern theft activity and that sort of thing.
Because our farmer friends, Mr. and Mrs. Farmer are not here, but they are very upset about people running a stop sign.
Right.
And so for you, that makes sense what proactive policing is, but it just didn't for me.
does,
So I just
yeah.
know for that couple, that is what they would like to see and you're explaining this 1/3 division. And when your department is too small, that third bucket doesn't get addressed.
Yeah, there was enough time for about 500 traffic stops last year. I think that was about the number. And 500 traffic stops, when you think about 11.3 full-time equivalents, I mean, what is that, a couple a week per officer? It's not very many, and that's the time that they have, right? And so unless you build that bucket of time back up, you won't get that type of enforcement. You just can't. Other questions?
When, you may not know this, but when our third shift officer, when he gets a call and it's a high priority, but the deputies aren't available, Mifflin doesn't have third shift, Linden takes a minute to get down here, he just responds on its own and just takes that huge risk.
Yeah, whether, there's occasions when that would happen, yes.
That's a safety issue for the officer. It's a safety issue for the community, but also it's a liability issue for the township because I don't know if anybody's tried to handcuff a person that doesn't want to be handcuffed, but when you're by yourself, you may have to use a significantly higher level of force to effect an arrest than if you had other officers with you. And so there's a liability component as well. Yes.
I just want to say thank you. This was so informative for me. My background is not in any type of law enforcement, so I feel completely educated now, and I really appreciate what you guys have done. I just wanted to say that. People feel free to ask more questions. This was really powerful, and I want to say thank you.
Thank you. We had I should also say my OSU background, I implemented a study very similar to this in 2013. So I've been using a model like this off and on for many years and looking at the effect. That's one of the things that I value most about my OSU time. And so watching how the staffing works, the model actually does work. Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you for your report, very fine report. Also, you taught me something. I didn't know. I thought I knew populations of Ohio. I didn't know Grandview was that large.
Yeah, Granville, Ohio is actually, I think they're around 5,600 right now. So they're actually over city status. But I think a good portion of that's the students when they're there. So.
I know for Thanksgiving a couple of years ago, and I was surprised how much traffic was there anymore.
Yes. It's also context specific. Your police department here does a good job with the resources they have. You have a very progressive police chief. I think highly of Chief Jones and what he's done here. But again, it's the situation. You have to plan for the situation. Right. Thanks.
Can I just go back to FTEs for 1 sec?
Yes.
So on page 4, I'm looking at table there, it's got 10 full-time patrol, 1 sergeant. The lieutenant, we know it doesn't count as a full FTE. So 10 and 1, that's 11. The lieutenant, you said, is about 80%?
So you have 9 patrol officers.
So the federal, is that?
Right, there's a
less
task
because of the
force
federal
officer.
Okay,
Right.
I got it.
Yeah, there is a task force officer, and we didn't look at that specifically, but again, in an area with this number of high priority calls for service, just anecdotally, it makes sense to me, but I can't offer an opinion about how to maintain that.
Yeah, the task force officer, just for those that aren't aware, we have an officer that's assigned full-time to Franklin County Special Investigations Unit. That allows us to have that unit in the township. Drug houses, prostitution we used to have, that was very physical on Cleveland Avenue. And we get to use that unit with a member assigned to it more readily than if we did not. That position is paid for itself more than I can imagine with those resources. I can tell you recently there's been 2 or 3 locations in the township we were able to shut down drug operations because of. Sometimes we have issues in the apartment corridors, I call it. They pop up, and once we are aware of something, this crew has moved in immediately and shut it down. Car break-ins at Lennox over there by the movie theater. We've had a rash recently of things happening over there. That unit will come in the evening and help out when needed if I need a couple plainclothes people. So that position, even though they're not out on patrol, we're definitely getting our, what I call bang for the buck, pun intended, out of that position that we have with those folks.
Yeah, those task force positions, we had some of those at OSU as well. And you think of those as a staffing multiplier, right? You may not get the full time of your one officer, but when you need them, you get them plus the task force members back in return. And so it's like kind of buying in to get additional resources. Other questions?
Did I hear you say about the sergeant, like every shift needs?
That, you know, it's really kind of outside of the scope of the study. I will tell you that if you're going to put really the difference there of 6 police officers back, then the general recognized span of control, even in the federal documents, they talk about 6 and 1. And so that's why we just recommend to go ahead and put that police sergeant position back. And again, if right now you have police supervision until about 2 o'clock in the morning on some nights, you don't have police supervision at night all the time, and that's when your highest liability calls are, right? That's inaccurate. That's when you have a higher ratio of high liability calls to regular calls. And so supervision at that time frame would be very beneficial.
A lot of times at nighttime, we only have 1 officer out there, period.
Right.
And that's extremely dangerous. I, for years, have said you should never have 1 officer out there by themselves, ever.
Yeah.
So, I get another one. This is where I'm going to get in trouble, but I'm just trying to play devil's advocate a little bit.
Please do.
I am a politician, and people are going to ask me this question.
Right.
If I just, Google police per capita or something,
Mm-hmm.
One of the first things that you run into is the Uniform Crime Reporting FBI site.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the first statistics there for our region in the Midwest is 2.6 per 1,000. And when you take, that's an average, okay? So obviously there's numbers above and beyond. But when you take that times our population, you would end up at 11.7 FTEs, not the 17 that you're recommending.
Mm-hmm.
So what do I say to people about that difference? Because I know we're not Mayberry, but we're not South Chicago either.
Yeah, I understand.
So how would you approach that conversation with a resident?
I would go back to that point that context is everything.
Mm-hmm.
So 2.5, is that what you said
Yeah,
the current number is?
2.6.
So I would ask you if 2.5 per 1,000 is the appropriate ratio for Clinton Township as opposed to Plain City or Upper Arlington or any other community. I mean, the problem with that type of ratio is it assumes that all of the calls are the same type of calls, and it's the exact distribution of one type of call, like the high priority versus the low priority. And I go back to that number, 5,549. I mean, you can't compare yourself to every other agency with no regard to the type of crime that you're experiencing. And what I will say is that if you go through any, I'm a certified law enforcement executive. It's a 1-year-long training program through the Ohio Association of Chiefs of Police, and they talk about resource allocation. And when you go to courses like that and talk to peers about this type of thing, in this discipline, there's very little value put on policing solely based off of those numbers because they don't take into account context. So that's the way I would answer.
All right, thanks.
Yep.
And that's, me and Trustee Sarah had that conversation, and that's why I wanted to bring outside folks in to view us in our perspective. Because, the averages, and I've gone off that average. I've told you that's what I referred to in the past. But having this group come in from the outside to see what our run volume is, what type of run, and I'm going to say too, a lot of the crime that I am aware of and see is what I call transient crime. It's not our residents committing the crime, it's folks from the other areas coming in and committing crimes in our township. And that also plays a factor with the area. Not so much on the west side, more on the east side with that. And nowhere, look up transient crime trends and, you're not gonna find much on that either. So that's something else that I think, and not taking away anything from you, but that's another thing too that folks need to understand, I guess, when we talk about that.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, Sean and I are going to stick around until the meeting is over. If you have questions or you'd like to talk one-on-one, we'd welcome the opportunity. And thanks again. We're honored to be part of the discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Now that my head hurts again, with working numbers for the last few weeks for these guys. Again, and thank you both from my point as well. Moving on to number 2, I'd like to request a resolution to hire part-time officer Cheyenne Hughes full-time at the step 1 rate of the bargaining unit effective Saturday, April 2nd. Salaries to be paid from Fund 2081-210-100.
So moved.
Second. Trustee Sierra?
Yes.
Trustee Grimm?
Yes.
Trustee Dunsberger?
Yes.
Item number 3, and I'm not sure if I'm wording this correctly or not, just to give folks information here. We had ordered some Dodge Cruisers back in December, and we recently got told a week ago from Dodge that they are canceling their production for this year. So we will not be getting those. So I'd like to request a motion to rescind resolution number 21-12-020 to officially cancel purchase order to Jim Shorkey Automotive in an amount of $81,986.
So moved.
Second.
Trustee Sierra?
Yes.
Trustee Grimm?
Yes.
Trustee Dunsberger?
Yes.
And the last item I have is to request a motion for a new purchase order to Buyers Auto in the amount of $87,020, and that would be for 2 Ford Explorers, one of those being a police unit and the other one a civilian model to replace the chief's car, so we can put that into the fleet to replace the second car we can't get in the police version.
Sorry, Chief, that's different than what's on the agenda. What was the amount again?
Oh, I'm sorry, we just did, that came out today.
That's okay.
So the total amount is $87,020, and that's to Buyers Auto. And we should see those probably, they're thinking May or June. They've been built, they have VIN numbers, so we should be good to go.
So moved.
Second.
Trustee Sierra?
Yes.
Trustee Grimm?
Yep.
Trustee Dunsberger?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. No news for Public Works?
Yeah, I had no new business on the agenda, but I did want to make a couple comments here to remind everybody about the brush pickup, since we've gotten several phone calls here lately about it, that it will not start until April 18th. So just want to let everybody, remind them of that. And I did send out an email to the trustees letting you know that Chris Muncy did pass his ODA test on the 9th.
Hey, Chris.
What does ODA stand for?
Ohio Department of Agriculture.
Sprayer. The sprayer.
Yeah, for pesticide applications.
Thank you for that. Code compliance?
I would like to ask for a motion to approve a 505.87 cleanup for 2076 Ormond Avenue. The parcel ID is 13000672500. I've included 4 pictures of the backyard.
So moved.
Second?
Trustee Sierra?
Yes.
Trustee Grimm?
Yep.
Trustee Dunsberger?
Yes.
Thank you.
Do we have any appreciations? Bobby?
Of the property. This whole thing, we're gonna give you a microphone. This whole thing has been a train wreck for me. I had a tenant in there, and due to COVID, he did not pay me rent for a whole year. I went to evict him before they had the non-eviction thing because he was not maintaining the property. And in fact, I went to jail during the height of the COVID before they had a vaccine for 3 days because of this. I am currently getting income of less than $900 a month. And that is from Social Security and OPERS. So I tried to get help because I'm 72 years old and I have COVID long haulers. I hired some people and they come for 1 day or less, enough to get cigarette money or whatever, and then they leave me with the stuff that they took out of the garage. I was trying to organize the garage to get everything put in the garage. I even asked Nick if he could find me some help so I could comply. He got in touch with someone here in maintenance, and I had arranged for him to come and work, but he ended up not showing up. I'm having the same problem getting help as your township is getting help. Now that they've increased the minimum wage to like fast food people, they're now paying them like $15 an hour, and they're short-staffed, so they're working them long shifts. So I cannot get any help to help me with this. And because of COVID, like a lot of people who volunteer are not volunteering anymore. I recently, my health insurance agent said he was going to see if he could get some Boy Scouts to help me, but they were not able to show up. So he came and helped me for 2 days. Another problem was it was lumber that was in the garage that I was going to reorganize so I could get, more stuff in there. I had to give up my storage unit because I couldn't afford it. And he wasn't able, to complete it. So I've been trying to comply. I'm not doing it because I don't want to do it. I'm not doing it
because I have these circumstances. So what I'm asking you is to let me have, I'm almost there. The thing I don't have done is I have nowhere to put some mechanical, like lawnmowers and rototiller and stuff like that in the garage. So I have it out back now with a tarp on it. It's not offensive. It's just has a tarp on it. And then I also have some fencing, two types of fencing. I have the white plastic panels, and I'm trying, when I have the money, to take it out of town and use it out of town. I have a property out of town at Indian Lake. And then the tenant put up chain link fence, and he put it up to what he wanted it to be like. And it doesn't work for me, so I took it down, and I'm trying to sell it. It's all very neat. The panels are stacked, and so what I'm asking for is a variance of some sort that stuff can exist the way it is until you can take care of it.
How old are these photographs?
2 days.
Nick, did you want to say something?
Yeah, this property's been a continuous problem, and I'll be quite honest, these things she's saying, I hear every week since I began here, so for about 6 months, and I haven't seen any progress in the past 6 months. Yeah, includes that.
Well, I had some help from the homeless shelter, and I gave him board and money to work. And Nick was out there when he was working. So it's not like I haven't done anything. And then due to the nature of his offense, his probation officer refused to let him work for me anyway. They thought that he was a danger to me. So I did have help around Thanksgiving time, and then he had to leave.
Ma'am, can I ask your name?
Janice Rogers.
Ms. Rogers, I'm very sympathetic to your struggles. I am, and I wish that we could find you some more help. But I have to tell you that these photos do not, to me, show neat piles.
Okay.
This is not.
He
If I
hasn't
were living
taken
next
any.
door to this, ma'am, let me finish, please.
Okay, I'm
If I
sorry.
were living next door to this, I would not call those.
Oh, I
neat
think
piles.
it's outrageous myself.
So I know that you have struggles, but we also have responsibility to your neighbors in the neighborhood, and we do have to balance that.
I'm almost
I
there.
agree.
I'm almost there. He hasn't taken any pictures today.
He just said that they were 2 days old, so he
No,
just
I've
took
worked
these.
solidly for 2 days and had help for 2 days. It doesn't look at all like that. And I would have taken a picture, but I lost my phone and I had no way to take pictures.
So I think if we try to reframe the thinking, this is the opportunity for the township to step in and give help that is actually safe and from people who really care about you as a resident and the other residents of the community. I don't know where you're finding this help, but I can tell you that it is very concerning because as an older woman, it's very frustrating that there are a lot of not honest people out there that would take advantage of you and your situation. And that's absolutely not okay, whether you know it or not. So I understand that these are your belongings, and I'm sure that they mean a lot to you. And it's hard to part with things. I understand that.
I'm trying to sell them for income.
But it needs to happen now because this is not safe. This is not safe for you. This is not safe for your neighbors.
It doesn't look like that now. He hasn't taken any pictures today after I worked. I started working at 4:15 this morning. And I only took a break to get something to eat. And I was working up until 6 o'clock.
So if
What is generally from the time we order a cleanup until Public Works can get to it, what generally is the time frame?
7 days.
7 days, ma'am. And when you guys show up on day 7, if there's nothing there to remove, nothing happens. Isn't that correct?
Correct.
7 days.
Okay. The only thing I'm asking is for the equipment that's covered with a tarp very neatly and the fence till I can get it taken, hauled away out of town to use. It's neatly stacked. It is not an eyesore.
So what we passed today is giving you 7 days to get this taken care of. And if things are taken care of on that 7th day and our men show up, there won't be anything for them to do.
I'm telling you right now, I can't do anything about the fence. It has to be used out of town and it has to be taken out of town, which I don't have the money to do that. Plus, I don't have a person out of town. It is not a priority to put that fence up out of town. The equipment, it's like the tenant brought in equipment that doesn't work. And I don't know if it can be fixed or not, but it is neatly under the tarp.
Okay, hang on one second. Chief Raley, do you know anyone through chat or even at the county that has any sort of access to helping individuals with moving items?
So I can reach out to the community health workers who basically look for those resources and see if we can find something. I can get a hold of the individual that's been coming here monthly when we finish the meeting and see if that might be a possibility and forward that information on tomorrow.
Okay.
I would like to, if possible, to take pictures of the fence and the equipment under the tarp to show that it is not offensive and
We'll get those. We can get those. You said you had some trouble with your phone or something, I think, earlier.
I lost it.
So, we can get new pictures. It's still, the 7 days is still a thing, but maybe we can find some help. Take a look at the pictures as well.
Yes, I'm just asking if you look at the fence, how it's neatly stacked, and the equipment under the tarp, it is not offensive. And verify if I get everything done but that, if that would be okay for the time being.
We'll do what we can to help you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming to talk about this, we appreciate your time.
Chief Raley, are you able to do that tomorrow and potentially see if maybe someone can come out tomorrow? I know it's late notice, but maybe no later than Monday.
So if I could get your contact information before you leave tonight, I can come out to the lobby with you and get a phone number.
We'll see, the problem is I have to get a phone.
She lost her phone. Okay.
I mean, we could set an appointment. If I don't live there right now. I'm trying to sell my house on Oakland Park. And I didn't even, they sent this to Kenworth, and I'm not even at Kenworth, I'm at Oakland Park. I'm going back and forth, working at Oakland Park and Ormond. So I need to make. I'll give you my email address.
So once we get done, we will have you meet with Chief Fraley out in the lobby, and he'll get your information, and then he'll be in touch with you, and he will see, and he will do everything possible to see if there's anything, any sort of resources that the county has available to offer. Okay? Okay. All right. Are there any other appreciations? Bobby?
First, before I do an appreciation, I have a question. I was reading the minutes and there was the Devin Allball that got a raise. Who is Devin Allball?
He's one of our road crew.
Public Works? Oh, okay, I didn't recognize the name, that's not what. Now, the other one is, I have an appreciation for Officer Goodwin. He was on the west side driving around last night, and I happened to be out talking to a neighbor, and he stopped, and he gave us a tour of his new Tesla car, explained all about it and all, and was very accommodating, so I want to give an appreciation to him for that.
Okay.
Well, it was amazing, the space that was in there, because you look at the car and it doesn't look very big. Yeah. But he was showing all the space in and down in here. I mean, it was really interesting to see because the design of this car is entirely different than our cars.
Did he show you the trunk?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, the trunk, and then you lift it up, and then there's storage area under there, and then all the electric is in the back there. Yeah. It was really interesting.
Yeah. So definitely everybody come April 30th and see what a trunk is.
I kind of have a motion that I would like to present. I don't know how to do this officially, but I guess I wanted to know if I could set forward a motion to create a more formal relationship, to have the township administrator, Matt Huffman, work more closely with Grandview on an ongoing basis regarding the progress of economic development in the JEDZ.
Can this be tabled until the next meeting?
I would like to add that as an agenda item for the next meeting if possible.
Okay.
So that'll just allow to get some motion language down, which really helps the chair a lot. So. Also, I was going to ask if we were going to get some motion language together about our new agenda process, because we rescinded some language. We decided to try something. I think it's kind of working for everybody. I haven't heard anything, but we should formalize it, I think.
Okay. You could add that for the next meeting too, if that's okay.
If there's nothing else, then I would like to make a motion to move into executive session pursuant to RC 121.22G8 for the purpose of considering confidential information related to the marketing plans, specific business strategy, trade secrets, and/or personal financial statements of an applicant for economic development assistance, or to negotiations with other political subdivisions respecting requests for economic development assistance that is to be provided or administered, Chapter 715 of the Revised Code, by unanimous quorum. The board hereby determines that the executive session is necessary to protect the possible investment or expenditure of public funds to be made in connection with the economic development project. And I would also like to make a motion to enter an executive session per ORC 121.22G1 to consider the compensation of public employees.
Second.
You seconding both or the last second one?
Both. One and the same. Yeah.
One and the same? Oh, okay.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. We are back in session at 8:52 PM, and I would like to make a motion to authorize a 3% pay raise for Glenda effective March 7th, 2022.
Second? Trustee Zero? Yes. Trustee Graham?
Yep.
Trustee Duffberger?
Yes. I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
Second.